right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to MOAD at Home. I hope everybody who's joining us today is safe and healthy. My name is Elizabeth Gessel and I'm the Director of Public Programs here at MOAD, and I'm excited to bring you this program with Ghanaian artist Ibrahim Mahama and in conversation with author Sarah Ladipo Manyika. I'm going to tell you a little bit about both of them, and then I will turn the program over to Sarah. Ibrahim Mahama was born in 1987 in Tamale, Ghana. He is an artist who lives and works in Accra, Kumasi and Tamale. He started his practice through his interest in the history of materials and architecture. His work is currently at the 22nd Sydney Biennale. He finished a year's residency with the DAAD in Berlin in 2018. In March 2019, he opened SCCA Tamale, which is an artist-run space built and dedicated to retrospectives of practices that emerged from the 20th century. His current interests are using specific architectural forms within history in the formation of spaces inspired by potentialities and the failures of modernity. Sarah Ladipo Manyika was raised in Nigeria and has lived in Kenya, France, Zimbabwe, and England. Sarah is a novelist, short story writer, and essayist, and founding books editor for Aussie.com. Her debut novel, Independence, is an international bestseller, while her second novel, Like a Mule Bringing Ice Cream to the Sun, has been translated into a number of languages. Her nonfiction includes personal essays and intimate profiles of people she meets, from Mrs. Harris to Pastor Evan Mawarire, to Toni Morrison and Michelle Obama. Sarah previously served on MOAD's board of directors and currently serves as board director for the Women's Writing Residency, Hedgebrook. Before I turn the program over to Sarah and Ibrahim, I want to let everyone know that if you have questions, please type them into the chat. Also, we would love to know where everyone is joining us from. So if you are outside the Bay Area, please type your location into the chat so we can celebrate our international audience. Now, please join me in welcoming Sarah Ladipo Manyika and Ibrahim Mahama. Oh, Sarah, sorry, you're muted again. Oops. Oh, okay.
Okay, can you hear me? Great.
Yes, I can. Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for putting all of this together at the very last minute, and thank you to MOAD. Thank you to everyone who is out there watching. I am super excited about this conversation, and I'm sure you will be too once you get to listen to Ibrahim. And Ibrahim, this is so wonderful to meet you virtually. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
How are you, and how is you're speaking to us from Accra?
Yes, I am. I'm doing very well. I've actually been in Accra since the 15th of March after I returned from Sydney. I was in quarantine for 2 weeks, and then we had a lockdown which started on the 3rd week when I was back in Accra. So literally, I have been at home for the last 6 to 7.
We just lost you there, but you've been at home for a while, I think is what you were saying.
Yeah.
Hopefully you're still with us. Yeah. Okay.
Yes, I am.
Okay. So, well, yes, I am with you in spirit in terms of lockdown. I should actually mention that as we are speaking, Elizabeth is running some images of some of your installation works. So this is, as you're listening to us, that's what you're seeing. Your installation works, as well as a space that you have created, an exhibit space, and we'll talk about that later on. So this is our first time of meeting virtually, and I'll just say for those who are listening, the first time that I heard about you and your art was when I was so flattered to hear that an artist had entitled one of their exhibitions after my first novel. which was absolutely, I couldn't believe it. It was amazing. That's definitely one of the high points in my artistic career so far to have that. But I mean, I was flattered, but at the same time, I was really excited because for me as a writer, I've always been very inspired by other art forms, not just other writers, but music, film, visual art has been a great inspiration for me. So let's just start there, talking about how you are inspired. You might want to talk a little bit about your exhibition Independence, which you can see in the window there. Perhaps talk about independence, but then also talk about how you're inspired by different art forms.
Yeah, so thank you very much. The work that is on screen is titled Non-Rentable in Cancer. It's actually an installation which I produced in 2016 for a project which I was working on with a couple of museums around the world, and also with my gallery in London. A year later, there was an idea to do another exhibition with my gallery in Italy, a Palazzo. So at the time, I was looking for a title for the entire exhibition. And prior to that, about 3 to 4 years ago, I started titling some of the works that I was producing and also exhibitions after novels. A lot of my work has been heavily inspired by events from the 60s, which actually is the starting point for your novel, Independence. And I was, when I was looking for a title for it, I was somehow fascinated by, first and foremost, just the sheer, like the title of it, like Independence, but it also can be independence, you know, in a way. I liked that aspect of it. So, and it's also because a lot of the materials that I've used in building the installation that you see on the screen are residues which are coming from factories which were built in a post-independence era in Ghana, which didn't last long after the 60s, because around the 60s, there was a movement of independence, freedom, and liberation around the world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So my question is always what went wrong within how the continent, because the continent had a future back then in the 60s when we're building all these beautiful monuments and then also empowering workers within the period. So there's a lot of questions within the work, in the materials that come in the formation of it itself. So your novel was actually quite beautiful because of the events that unfold within it, which is actually the love story between the two protagonists within the story. And I somehow see it as the same way of this love, bitter, sweet story of like workers working within factories, within the newly formed independent states, who are struggling to somehow contribute their labor into the economy at the same time, whilst indecisions within the political system is somehow hindering them from maybe making the contributions that they want to make. So that was the point that I came into the book from.
Yeah, and I just love, when I look at your work, I love the way that you play with this notion of independence and interdependence, how we are interdependent on each other as a world globally, and living through this sort of age of the pandemic is just kind of underscoring that, underlining that even more. And I wonder, I mean, just speaking about just grounding us very much in the present, what your thinking is about art, particularly at a time like this, or perhaps the power of art, or how your art has been changed, or how you're thinking anew about art?
I don't know. I have always thought that art should truly be democratic, whichever form that it takes. People should be able to have access to it and should be able to interpret it regardless of where they find themselves, the conditions and the situation. Historically, I've found that a lot of artists tend to produce work, and those works just end up being consumed either within the traditional museums of a gallery or a museum, or even if it's just like through a certain authorship, like if it's a novel or a book or something like that. But I've always thought that it's also very important for us to be able to build a certain framework or a certain infrastructure around the objects or the works that we build, in a way that it begins to maybe situate it, it begins to ground it locally, in a way that it can give rights and access to people who ordinarily wouldn't have access to these kinds of materials or objects or worldviews. Because as artists, what we do is that we take political conditions and we turn them into these experiences, but it's not everyone who can somehow experience this. So I've always thought that art within the 21st century has to evolve beyond just being an object. It also has to take into consideration the political conditions within a given space and time. And it's also at the same time has to go back in time in order to revise and rechange things in the way that we look at things.
So can you expand on that? For example, we have this image up of the piece from the Independence exhibition. Can you expand on that by just talking specifically about this piece?
Yes, so this piece, so the work on the screen is titled Non-Orientable in Cancer. And there are three versions of this work. So there is one version which is in Miami in a museum collection. And then there is another one which is in the collection of the National Gallery of Canada in Ottawa. And then I have the final version, which is with me here in Accra and Tamale. So the institution that we will talk about later, which I started building a couple of years ago, the idea was that I would concentrate a part of my practice into building these series of institutions that can actually inhabit these works that people locally can experience. Because when I originally made this work, it was made up of all the residues of some of the factories that were built in the post-independence era around the 60s that later were left to decay. And also parts of the trains that were used in the 20th century for exploitation, residues of like documents that were collected from like archives and things like that. So I thought that it was important to somehow create a space that this work will be grounded and situated in here. Because as artists, we spend most of our time making works of art and objects that travel around the world. Of course, it's very important because what we do is supposed to be universal, and everyone around the world it's part of the voice that we use in building the work that we make. But at the same time, we also realize that there's always this kind of inequality also within the work that is made and how it is consumed in the end. So I thought that it was really important to somehow factor all of this into the composition of the image. So this you see on the screen is in a gallery in Italy, a Palazzo Gallery. There is another image of the work in a a White Cube Gallery in London. And then you also see images of, let's say, the work in one of the collections in Miami, which is in. But in Ghana, you never really see an image like this. So part of my work, as I go back to the question that you asked before, the role of the artist now was to be able to create that necessary condition. So the idea of the image, which somehow travels around the world, or you see, for instance, in New York or in London, you could see that same image in the context of Ghana or Nigeria or South Africa or Niger or anywhere you think about within the local context.
I think, I just want to say a quick word about accessibility. We had touched base just very briefly yesterday in preparation for today, and you were talking about how you were going around trying to find a Wi-Fi router. Here in America and Europe, people are looking for toilet roll, but you're looking for kind of ways to better access the internet. And I think it's very interesting because I think one of the silver linings of this pandemic era is that we're having these sorts of conversations. I don't know if we would have had these sorts of conversations before, which is fantastic, and it certainly is opening it up to a much larger audience globally as we see watching, participating today. But at the same time, there are differences as well. There's some parts of the world that are better connected and there's more access than others,
Yes.
perhaps. I think what I want to do is just pause. You have your work is just so phenomenal on so many levels, and it's so multi-layered. I love the way that you harken back to history and you speak to the future. Just the work itself is sort of breaking boundaries artistically, I find. And I want to show, ask Elizabeth if she can show a video of one of your installations that really speaks to me. Don't be surprised if there's a book in the future that has this image in it. So this is Just As We Wait. It's a 1-minute video.
Yeah, so this is quite interesting because at the recent Sydney Biennale, at the opening, I was taking a couple of friends through visitors through the installation that I had made with my studio assistant in Sydney. And we're just having a conversation, and this young girl comes into the installations and starts dancing. And he had accompanied his father to the exhibition on this Cockatoo Island in Sydney. And I thought it was actually quite beautiful because the work is it's very dark in terms of its content and also in terms of the sites and the histories that it brings into the foreground. But at the same time, it's also like just a beautiful object. And for me, it was quite fascinating to see how that operated and how this child, who is so much unaware of all these histories, takes this very like heavy installation very lightly and uses it as a playground. For me, I think that has always been one of the most important things, to be able to at least produce work that seems very serious, but at the same time, it is something which is really accessible and everyone can relate to it on their own level. Yeah.
I think it's just amazing, and that it's also serendipitous that this young girl dancing is even more powerful. So it's not staged. I mean, I'd love for you to talk about this exhibition, but I'll tell you, without you telling us what the exhibit is about. For me, as I just looked at it, I may be wrong, but I take that the texture in the background is jute bags.
Yes.
I don't know if that's correct, but which would be used to carry cocoa beans,
Yes,
amongst other commodities. And from my knowledge of, like, my limited knowledge, so you can correct me, educate me, but Ghana is one of two or three of the foremost producers of cocoa. And
yes,
and yet I'm sure that the amount of money from the cocoa industry that comes back to Ghana is a sliver, because Ghana is not producing the actual chocolate. It's the kind of the raw materials.
exactly.
And so for me, there's something haunting about seeing this and knowing about sort of big business and you know, the journeys that these sacks have taken, and then seeing this child in this immense space and sort of getting the feeling that the future is for this child, this small child here. And she's sort of doing a sort of classical ballerina dance, which generally people wouldn't associate with Africa or West Africa. Like the world is her oyster in a way. And it's, so for me, it's a very,
Yes.
There's maybe sort of stuff that drags you down about the past, but here is this child, and the opportunities for this child. And when we go on to talk about your studio in Tamale, we'll talk about how you're very focused on children and how you want to give children more opportunities to see the world differently and so forth. And this for me is just such a powerful representation that when I first saw it, it brought me to tears. So, yeah.
Yeah. The work itself, the jutes, they are coming from cocoa, from cocoa. So Ghana doesn't produce the jute sacks. The jute sacks are normally produced in India and Bangladesh. And when they're imported into Ghana, they give it to the cocoa buying companies, and it's state owned. So they buy the produce from the farmers, and then they bag them, and then they export them. but the bags normally remain and the cocoa goes abroad. So between Ghana, in the 20th century, Ghana was the largest producer of cocoa in the world. Around the time of the 50s, 60s, a lot of money that was made from cocoa was what was used in the establishment of like factories, and then also these silos that were built at the time. And Ghana had a very deep connection with Eastern Europe at the time, because there were also issues regarding liberation struggles and all that, which with the non-alliance movement. The cocoa sacks, when the cocoa goes to Europe and they are sold, because we don't have factories here that produce, that processes the cocoa into final products. So between Ghana and Ivory Coast, let's say if $150 billion a year is made up of the chocolate industry, between the both of us, we only make less than 3 billion. So it means that at the end of the day, the farmers who put all the labor into growing these cash crops are not really rewarded the way they're supposed to, because if you do not have the processing plant, then it means that you almost have to somehow undercut the prices and things like that. And there isn't a common or unified market also within Africa, because I remember back in the 60s when the African Union was founded, the idea was how to bring all these commodities and also the markets within Africa on a common plane, so we could somehow negotiate with the West. But it's something that has constantly failed again and again. And as we see now, we are constantly in debt and borrowing a lot of money from the World Bank and the IMF. And it comes with so many conditions of not being able to create all these processing plants within on the continent. So it doesn't really allow for value to be made. So when I collect these materials, all these histories are loaded within it. And this particular image, the space that you see is an old factory space, which was used in producing ships around the Second World War. And before that, it was an island which used to be a meeting place for the Aboriginals before Captain Cook actually made his voyage to Australia. So I'm looking at all these histories. By the end of the day, it's also very promising in terms of what is within this system that I'm talking about and what the potentials are. If we go back in the 60s and we look at the agenda of Africa in terms of development and all that, there's a lot of promise. So I think I base my work based on that promise, but it's just that the aesthetics that is produced out of it seems very gloomy and dark, but generally it's also based on promise.
Yeah, and I just love I love the way that you use the local to speak to the global, and just multi-layers of history around the world is just extremely powerful. We have another video clip that I wanted to turn to, but before we actually play the clip, Elizabeth, one of the things that's also very striking for me, Ibrahim, is your commitment to the community and social responsibility. And yes, if I'm, from what I read, if I'm correct, I think with your first big international piece, you began to use those funds to try and think about ways to channel back and to give back to the community, to inspire others. And this is just a really great inspiration to me and to artists around the world, I think, just to see how, you make a name for yourself. And my goodness, what a name you have, and you're still relatively early in your career and young, and you're already plowing it back, and it's very impressive. So we have a clip that's coming from your studio in Tamale, where I think when Elizabeth plays it, people can see, one of the projects that you're doing.
Yes, this one. Yeah, it's actually
lack the opportunity in being able to see the world differently. And I think by situating this studio with what it proposes in Jenatron, which is like a suburb outside the cosmopolitan Tamale, it's a rural small village, and there are so many villages like that which are connected to the bigger cosmopolitan city. And I think it's particularly important because it gives a different sense of empowerment and also hope and aspiration within those spaces. And I think it's particularly important because we have to encourage more people within our generation to be able to situate ideas and forms within spaces which ordinarily we wouldn't expect, because it allows for those spaces to be able to grow. And it also gives birth to new forms of thinking and new forms of ingenuity among the younger generation, and particularly children. You cannot deny that when you transform an airplane into a classroom, which gives a child an opportunity to be able to study, his view of the world is particularly going to be very different rather than sitting in a classroom which is being built by blocks and concrete. And for me, I think that those little differences and the intentionality within the way in which we construct forms within the world and give them new meanings can go a long way in social transformation, and particularly also ideological transformation, which will lead to a new kind of social relation within the world at large.
So that's so awesome. I mean, you're showing their young child using drone technology.
Yes.
And it's actually interesting. I mean, this is a much longer conversation, but I think for some artists, there's a lot of sort of suspicion, and understandably so, around technology and the surveillance state and so forth, and drone technology. And yet there you are showing how drone technology is just kind of transformative.
Yes, I think it's important because the idea of drones, of course, we know what they've been used for in warfare and all that, but also you can't deny the fact that it gives us a very different experience of the world if we use it just one casually, and also if we use it in the exploration of the environment, and also it also expands the imagination. I became interested in this in 2015. Before, when I used to make my installations, they were based on individual projects. So for instance, when I started covering all these buildings around in Ghana, I used to do single projects at a time. But when I started, when I became interested in the drones, I was interested in the idea that because the drone is above the ground, it gives you a very different view of the world. So you can actually connect spaces simultaneously. So there was a project I did in 2015 with my colleagues in Kumasi Black Star Lines, titled The Exchange Exchanger. And actually this project was connecting 22 different buildings between Kumasi and Accra. And because I was using the drone, I could actually photograph all the projects in one single image. Before, if you're standing in front of a building, you wouldn't be able to see a building which is a kilometer away. But because the drone actually is able to connect you from one space to the other, whilst you stand just at one location, it somehow expands your worldview and it's able to connect all the various points within a geographical location. So I thought that was actually quite promising. So subsequently, all the other projects that I did, I started thinking about that and how I could incorporate it into my practice. And that led me into collecting these old airplanes which were abandoned at the not necessarily abandoned, but they were decommissioned and they were sitting at the airport for many years. And I thought I could take them to Tamale and then take the seats out of it and then use it for classrooms where we could teach these drone technologies or coding or even drawing lessons and things like that.
No, I think it's fascinating. It's amazing. I'm always interested when I speak to artists to know whose shoulders you stand on, this notion of standing on the shoulders of giants. I mean, when I look at your work, we were talking about the jute sacks. I was thinking about Yinka Shonibare, who uses the Dutch wax cottons in a similar way in terms of showing sort of the entanglement of Europe and the rest of the world, Africa, over time. I think there's a certain installation aspect. Wangechi Muchu's work, a lot of her sort of focus on form and material, and particularly the female body. So these are artists that come to mind as I sort of look at your work, but I wonder, who has inspired you?
Yeah, I think one of our biggest inspiration, I studied at the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology. So at the painting and sculpture department, one of our professors, Dr. Karikacha Seidu, has always been a very heavy influence on us as his students and also as his friends. He taught us everything that we know about philosophy, materiality, even art itself, just looking at painting, history of art. And I've always thought that it's a very important highlight within my practice, because without him, I would have never really gathered the courage to think in a way that I think today as an artist. Because what he did was that he always thought that we have to look at the limitations which is within art history and somehow make up for it through the work that we produce. So that's how come I work within the way that I do produce. So if you're an artist that is producing painting, how can your painting somehow change the very notion or the history of painting in itself to somehow include other voices? Because it's not just when you make work as a painter, which hangs in a gallery, that's not just where it ends. There is a lot of, there is so much discourse that goes beyond it. And also sometimes based on just the sheer limitations of it, it's already cuts away an entire world from it. So I'm somehow interested in all the antagonisms that come with producing anything and somehow putting it all together to create a new form or an object which no one maybe has never experienced before or does not even really exist. Because at the end of the day, we do not produce art, any art form, because it already exists. We produce it because we have a vision of the world and we want to produce an object or a work that somehow allows us to see things differently. So if you ask influences, I would start with him and somehow end with him within this moment, because he represents something much bigger than an individual, in a way that a system can change when individuals actually sacrifice and commit to it. And regarding form, also, I'm inspired by a lot of different artists from the 60s, looking at minimalism till now. I mostly don't really look at my work in terms of just the ordinary material. So for instance, there are a lot of artists who work with the jute sacks. For Yinka Shonibari, I was a very important influence in art school because we studied a lot about his work. Eleanor Tree, Neno Corey, and all these artists. But no, mostly I just like to look at the work beyond the material and look at the motivations that are within it and what it can be. Yeah, later on.
I have to say, just as an artist, I'm always curious about people's backdrop, and your backdrop is full. And I don't know if that's a prayer shawl or it just reminds me we're in Ramadan, and I should say Ramadan Mubarak, because I know that this is many people in Ghana celebrating breaking the fast around this time. Yeah, so your backdrop is full, and it's just for me, it's like a representation of you. There's so many influences and so many, from text to I don't know.
My background is just me being messy. I tried as much as possible to cover all the things. I have Polaroids, some books. I used to have a lot of books here, but I gave it all out to the library at SCCA in Tamale. So I have all the books there. But some of these that you see are my notebooks. I do write a lot within my notebooks. So I have quite a lot of notebooks that I've built over the last couple of years. So I keep those, and then I read them from time to time to see how my thinking is changing, and I go back to them again.
That's great. Do you want to add anything or ask any questions the other way around before I see we're beginning to get questions from the audience, but just, yeah.
Yes, I have just two questions I wanted to ask you. One of that was that, yes, how do you imagine the future of arts in the arts in the continent? And what form do you see it taking? Maybe with your own observation now with artistic practice, not just in visual, but like in literature or in poetry or film. Like, yeah.
Oh, that's a tiny question. I'll just say that I'm very excited about what I'm seeing across artistic genres. And, someone like you is very exciting for me, not only because of what you're producing, but what you're enabling others to produce and how you're enabling others to dream and to think. And that's really, really exciting. The area that I know best is literature. And so I'm encouraged by publishing companies, particularly within the continent. I'm represented by Cassava Public Press. And in fact, I think about the founder of Cassava Public Press, Bibi Bakare Yusuf, when I think about your work as well, because she often talks about archiving the future in the present. I hope I've got that right. But anyway, definitely the idea of archiving and the importance of gathering stories is vital and important, and the importance of Africans themselves being holding showing the direction instead of sort of accepting narratives and so forth from other parts of the world. And so I see more participation, I guess is what I'm saying, at least in the literary arts. I see more, people doing science fiction, graphic novels, a proliferation of different forms, and that's really exciting, and not being hemmed in by what the West has expected traditionally. That really, really excites me. And again, just to repeat what I said before, I'm someone who strongly believes in the importance of artists big upping each other and serving as mentors. And I often have felt that I haven't seen that so much in the past. And even today, I'm always like, the artistic world is a very small world, and I'd love to see more of us just being able to encourage each other and give others platforms. It's vital, it's important. So that's my roundabout way of answering your tiny little question.
And the last one is, do you ever imagine your work actually turned into a feature film?
Oh, yes. Are you a filmmaker? Can you do it?
No, one of my limitations.
Come on, you can try something new. No, definitely both of them, but the both novels, Independence, I see it as a film. And as I was mentioning before, I'm so influenced by other art forms. And so even the way that Independence begins, it says, we could start with a particular image, but instead we'll start with a different image. So there's kind of a nod to image. Like a Mule Bringing Ice Cream to the Sun starts with a quote from the film The Lunchbox. And the quote is, I think we forget things if we have no time. I think we forget things if we have no one to tell them to. And that's by Ritesh Johinder Batra. So again, film has just been such an inspiration for me. And I think film really excites me as an artistic genre, because I feel that more people have access to film, perhaps, than going to museums or even buying a book. So it feels, in a sense, more of a democratic form. It's not so much a democratic form, but a more accessible form to a larger group of people.
Yes, no, I totally agree.
So it looks like Elizabeth, but before I'm such a bossy one here. I want to say to all of the people who are watching and listening that the Museum of the African Diaspora is very close to my heart. As Elizabeth said, I served on the board before. And I would really encourage people who are able to just think about supporting museums and arts institutions wherever you are. If you're in the Bay Area, particularly MOAD, but arts institutions around the world. Everyone is suffering at this time, but arts institutions particularly. And they are so important. I think one of the things that strikes me about this era of the pandemic is, what would we do without art? People are singing, they're reading, they're dancing, they're making noise. It's art art is vital, and telling our stories and sharing our stories is vital. So that's my little spiel, and I'll shut up now and see if there are some questions that Ibrahim, you can answer.
Okay, I'm going to read some questions from the chat. So the first one is to Ibrahim. You often mention architecture when referring to your installations and materials. How does architecture affect your art/thought process? Do you think of the space where it will be exhibited prior?
Yes, I think mostly the space actually determines the form that the work takes. When I was in art school, we were heavily encouraged by our teachers to explore spaces outside of the university, like just go to town. And when I mean architecture, it's not just in terms of buildings, it could also be structures, just makeshift structures also which are within the city. Because when you go to the African market, you find a lot of people construct their own small structures. And sometimes there are lots of these repetitions within the same structure within the market, which the women organize themselves around to sell things. And if you take it and you place it within the context of art, sometimes it's actually quite promising in terms of the images that's born out of it. And myself, I started looking at old factories that were produced in the late 19th century and early 20th century, actually for the refurbishment and fixing of trains and an industry and all that. And I said to myself, how can this actually inspire or create new forms of art which could be experienced in different ways? So the installation Non-Rentable in Cancer, which I used for the Independence exhibition, actually was born out of that, because I was making the installation from the residues of the trains from the factory, and then first and foremost installing the work in the old factory in 2nd D. So the spaces that were in between the buildings was the first spaces that actually experienced or witnessed the work of art in itself. So it's not, yeah. And there are many exhibitions. I can see Marianne listening. And yeah, we're working on a project in Pompidou. And last year I actually traveled to see this, to see the space for the first time. And I think as artists and practitioners, we do this all the time, where we travel to see spaces around the world in order to be able to respond to it. So it's not, of course, there are artists or painters who still make works in a traditional sense, which would hang in the space. But for me, it's always important to be able to see the space before I can respond to it, and the type of work that actually fits in within it.
Thank you. So there are a few questions about the relationship to literature and your work. One person asks about whether we should not bring more art into book fairs, especially in Africa, and books into art fairs. There's also a question about what authors are inspiring you right now, aside from Sarah, who's inspirational to everyone, of course.
No,
books. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think currently I'm working on finishing my PhD, if I ever finish. Yeah, so there's just a lot of work, yeah, literature on like philosophy, looking at issues regarding time. Yeah, so I read quite a lot of different materials, and I also fall heavily on film. One of the science fiction, there are 2 films, just popular films. So there are 2 films which I have been trying to really understand in the last couple of months. One of them, which is Interstellar, which was made by Christopher Nolan, and the other one, which is The Arrival. So the issue regarding time and place, and then going back and forth in between things. Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's first president, also wrote quite a lot of literature on like issues regarding independence and liberation struggles and things like that. So it's also some of the things that I somehow concentrate on within this period. And the installation which I did in, Sarah asked me a question recently about No Friend But the Mountains, about this book, which I was referencing for the project that I did in Sydney recently, and then also another book, A Grain of Wheat, which I was using for another installation in Sydney. But I think sometimes for me, it's also about the titles that the authors also choose for the work that they choose to produce. Because sometimes when we produce a work, it takes quite a long time. There are many works that I've done in the past where I only made up the title maybe an hour before before I sent the proposal away, because you're always struggling to be able to find, and somehow the title always sums up the project very beautifully in a way that it's constructed in itself. So yeah, I guess I am generally just looking at many different things, but I heavily tend to focus on films these days and trying to see what they present. Yeah.
So I just wanted to add a little thing about visual artists and literary artists working together. I see that Victor Ekpuk, who's another great artist, is part of the audience. And
Yes.
One of the things that I've enjoyed over the last few years is seeing how Victor has illustrated some of the canonical texts, Chinua Achebe's books, for example, and just these beautiful images. And for so long, book covers by African authors have been so sort of stereotypical and you know, just not, the book covers have not been great, let's just put it that way. And it's exciting for me to see that collaboration, cross artistic genre collaboration. And I just want to add a little bit about sort of the question about sort of, I think there was a question about reading at this time. One of the things that's interesting for me is I'm returning to a lot of older texts, and also some some newer texts I hadn't read. So I had never read Colson Whitehead's The Underground Railway. And I'm looking at a memoir by Mary Seacole. And it's interesting for me to see both of these authors. So that's a nonfiction and a fictional piece. It's interesting to see how they talk about cholera, how they talk about the plague, yellow fever. And I think in the past, when I was reading those texts, I would have sort of glossed over that. Now I really stop and I think and I consider, you know, the impact of those illnesses and how it relates to what we're going through.
Yeah, I want to make a big correction. Actually, when I mentioned Marianne, I got the museum wrongly. I hope I'm not in trouble. It's not Pompidou, actually, it's Palais de Tokyo. I guess the pandemic has an effect on the brain.
So
yeah.
Let's just put this caveat. If we've said anything that's incorrect, it's okay. We're human. People can watch the video later and say, no, that's not correct. I'm sure I've made mistakes too.
Yeah.
So you ended the answer to the last question about talking about how you title things, and somebody has a question specifically about one of the titles of your work. So it says, I'm currently writing about Straight Line Through the Carcass of History, 1649, exhibited at the Ghanaian National Pavilion of the 56th Venice Biennale. May I ask the importance of this year? In my research, I have found major ports were built by European colonial powers. Can you speak a little bit on the title of this installation?
The Straight Line Through the Carcass of History. Yeah, the title, 18. One of there is a lot of the materials that was used in the production of this work actually came from the coast of West Africa, where you have these women who practice in smoking fish. There is fort, actually, Asha Fort, which is just around the coast in Accra. It was one of the first spaces that I actually tested this work in, which was going to Venice before it did go to Venice. So the Straight Line Through the Carcass of History was actually a title that I coined when I was doing a residency project, a residency in Berlin, as part of, no, not in Berlin, in Athens, as part of Documenta 14. yeah, because I was visiting all these sites, marble sites and other sites around the country for my research for the work that I was producing at the time. So when I went back to Germany to work on this residency, which I was doing with the DAAD, there was an exhibition which I was supposed to have worked on. So I titled it A Straight Line Through the Carcass of History, because prior to that, I had done a project in Malta, in this old fish market, which which the Maltese stopped using because when they joined the European Union, they had to stop using the fish market because it didn't fall under the conditions of a fish market within the European setting. So they were thinking about demolishing the space. But when I was invited by the curator, I was actually trying to propose a work that would allow them to look at the space much closer. So we worked with an architect to restore parts of the building and also produce an artwork, which was almost like a line dividing the space into two equal parts, which was transparent. So when you came into the room, into the building, the installation was somehow holding the building from top to bottom. And because it looked like it was falling apart, everyone who saw the installation almost thought that the work wasn't a work of art and it was something structural which was supporting the building from falling down. So I titled it Straight Line Through the Carcass of History because it actually dealt with the history of Malta in relation to the Mediterranean, because a lot of Africans, when they leave Morocco, Libya, or other places, Malta is normally one of the first places which they go to before they work through to earn money to maybe go to Central Europe, where they spend most of their lives. So the Ashford prison was somehow also in relation to that history. I was trying to reference both of it. So the title and the timeline also comes from that specific history.
Okay, and then I know you talk about this in your video. How does the production process of your installations address issues of labor?
Yes, so there are many different, it depends on the work, the specific work which is being produced. So for instance, in the sacks itself, one of the important things that I considered was where to collect the materials from. The specific materials that I'm interested in are the ones which have been used by the charcoal sellers, because at that point, it's almost at the lowest point because it's been used to bag cocoa, to maize, to rice, to onions and whatever. And finally, when it's used to bag charcoal, because of what charcoal does to the material in itself, so it means you can no longer put rice or any other thing into the material. And when they use it over time, the market traders, when they cut open the bag and they have to restitch it together, sometimes they stitch it together with old strands of clothes or things like that. So the bag almost becomes a living thing. So I was mostly interested in the labor process that goes actually into producing all the commodities that went into it before to the charcoal itself that possesses the material. So what I do is that I buy new bags and then I give it to the traders, and then I take the old bags and I work with both the traders and also migrant workers who travel from outside the capital to the big capitals, the big centers to work. And then we actually sit down to stitch this thing together one by one. So the installation you saw with the child dancing in the foreground, actually everything is stitched by hand. So I'm very much interested in how their labor is somehow implicated within the labor systems that actually give birth to these objects and these aesthetics even in the first place. So it's not, sometimes where people like to use the NGO language of giving back or charity, but it's not that. It's just me as an artist trying to really understand the way that the history of labor has somehow constructed the world in a certain way that we experience every day. But we never really take it into serious account until it really overwhelms us, like the current pandemic situation, because when you're constantly, a lot of artists or practitioners constantly talk about the issues of crisis and how the world has always been in crisis every day, particularly given how capital operates and how it makes the rich richer by the day and the poor poorer. and how we've not created adequate systems for healthcare and all these things. And now within this pandemic, we've seen that, yes, it's the poorest people who are suffering the most from this. And then also the countries like the United States that has always prided itself as the champions of like democracy, healthcare, blah, blah, blah. We see that it's not necessarily true. So because what the United States is experiencing, I think if Ghana had experienced half of it, I was telling a joke to my friend the other day, all of us would have run away. We would have gone into the sea because it's really serious, you know. So I think that we ought to take issues that are happening within the world very seriously. And as artists, we can only try to amplify that within the work that we do.
Thank you so much. I think that is a perfect segue to showing on the screen some of these organizations and studios that you've started and that you support. I want everybody to take note of ways to connect with Ibrahim and the work that he's doing. Thank you so much for being part of this conversation. Sarah, do you want to say any last words?
No, I just want to thank you, Elizabeth. I want to thank you, Ibrahim. As we've been talking, there are many writers who've been watching, from Romeo Oriogun to Rowena Singer to Marty Pascal, Nia McAllister. There are lots of writers here. So if you ever want inspiration for new titles, you know, some of these writers are sitting here and I can give you some names of these writers. But thank you so much for what you do. Thank you for inspiring us all. Thank you everyone out there for inspiring us and for being there for us today. And just wishing everyone well, stay healthy. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, I do have one last thing, so don't go away quite yet. I do want to thank you, Ibrahim and Sarah, and everyone for joining us today. And please do consider donating to MOAD, either on the MOAD website at moadsf.org, or you can give by cell by texting 56512 to MOAD SF, and then you will follow the link to make a donation. All the donations go to support free public programming during the museum closure. And please check out our calendar at moadsf.org to see all of the online programming that we are doing during the physical closure of our building. Thank you both so much for your time and your generosity, especially you, Ibrahim. It's been wonderful to get to know you over the past couple days, and I look forward to staying connected with you and MOAD in the future. So stay safe, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.